So up to this point, we've kind of concentrated on attacks where one side, for whatever reason, hasn't castled, or their king has castled and it's drawn out of their safety of its position very quickly. Now, we are moving on to the concept of castling in this chapter. I'm sure you're aware of the concept of castling, but we're going to look at it in quite a lot of detail, as the author does. He goes on to note that historically, chess, when it was invented, didn't have castling as a rule. The old Indian version of chess, castling was not a concept. And funnily enough, Kramnik has proposed a version of chess recently where castling again becomes obsolete. So it's funny how, as in life, often a full circle comes about with evolution and going back to ideas of old to progress. But castling, of course, is a good move for a number of reasons. Number one, it brings pieces, the rook, into the game very quickly. The rook can be a very good piece to attack. Positionally, it's good for that same reason. Your king gets to safety. Your king clears out the way, so you can rely on your pieces. And it is, of course, something which you should strive to do. We will now look at this, like I say, in more details. There is another thing we're going to look at, the artificial castling method. That's kind of where you move your king and rook around. I mean, okay, this is not a move to play, but just to show you what I mean, in some ways by artificial castling, these moves are absolutely terrible, but I'm just showing you the concept. This is one way of artificially castling. But of course, castling is the only move in chess where you move two pieces at the same time, which is another reason why it's good for development. And it is, as stated by the author, a natural progression in chess from the old state, because it quickens up the game, makes it more exciting, and allows more complex struggles, because the kings can get safe quickly. So I don't know what you think about getting rid of castling again. That's a discussion for another day, but let's now move on to the different elements of this. Well, I gave a demonstration of artificial castling in an extremely bad way at the start there. And we're really concentrating on normal castling for this chapter of the course, but let's just have a look at what this artificial castling involves. It's basically where a player creates a position of castling in the same way as castling, but he doesn't do it in a single move, therefore saving time, but in a series of moves, moving the king and the rook, therefore losing quite a great deal of time in the process. So it's not to be played unless you have to. And this position demonstrates that. In this position, it's actually a good thing to do, because this setup with a bishop on c4 and the knight on c3 can often be met by the following tactics, something you learn quite as a junior, I'd say: knight takes e4. And this is known to equalize in a lot of positions because you get rid of a good central pawn. The point being, if that's captured, we go d5. And this position is quite complex still after bishop d3. This, nowadays, theoretically, probably even here, white's got some small edge, so it doesn't quite equalize. But there are even interesting ideas with f5. So, all in all, after knight takes e4, white should play that line if he knows it. But a lot of people will be tempted into playing bishop f7 because they're like, oh yeah, I've got a chance. I'm not going to sacrifice material, but I'm forcing my opponent's king out. And you've got to be careful by doing this capture on f7 because often you encourage artificial castling, as would happen after king takes f7, knight takes e4. And even though it seems that white has achieved a great deal, in actual fact, white's given up the centre. We can clearly see that bishop d3 move was better. As after d5, the knight has to move. There's certainly no tactical ideas here. Why should there be? The king is well defended. It can come back here. So the knight has to retreat. And now black can artificially castle with rook f8, let's say d3, king g8, and black is clearly better here. Clearly better because this pawn here is not irrelevant. It actually helps black get initiative along the f file. and black has the centre and the two bishops. So it's clearly good for black, this kind of thing. So be careful when you're encouraging these king advances. They're not always going to be completely successful, as this one clearly isn't. Now, the next couple of videos may seem quite obvious to you, the correct moment to castle. As beginners, we're always taught to castle as quickly as possible, and as general advice, that's good advice. And the problem with general advice is it can often be wrong. Don't forget that, especially in such a complex game as chess. Whatever advice I give you, bear it in mind, but it's not going to work in every situation. Clearly not. So normally that is what you want to do. Castle as quickly as you can for the normal reasons. King safety, quick development, blah, blah, blah. But there are some situations which it's going to be postponed. And the author gives two main situations where that is the case. And the two main situations he gives where, number one, why castling should be postponed and not done as quickly as possible, is because some other action is more useful. So castling is not the key thing in the game. Maybe you've got an attack going, brewing, you can win material, win a pawn. So castling, you don't need to do that. Or even just swapping off the right piece. So you can just think, if there's something obvious that's better than castling, don't castle. The second example he gives is because it's actually you're castling into an attack. You know, you're not really following the demands of the position. Your opponent's waiting for you to castle some way, and there you go. You castled into his attack. Woohoo! Your opponent's happy. I can think of many cases where I often set up a good attack, waiting for my opponent's castle, and sometimes they do. Yes, sometimes they don't. They smell a rat. And the next example is a basic example of that. Now, I suppose we're looking at it from the side of the castler. Has that been a verb used? Anyway, so we're going to have a pretty standard king's pawn, Gyokyo piano opening. No Evans here, more restrained. And after knight f6, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, d6. And this is all very normal here. Maybe the bishop g5 move, you could say, is quite premature. And a lot of people here would castle. What on earth could be wrong with castling? Well, we'll find out. Maybe you can see it already. A better way to play in this position would be to just play knight to c3. We have some ideas of knight to this one. We're not committing our king. And now we turn the tables on black. If black castles, he will prematurely be castling. And this is quite beginner stuff, really. This is one of the first things you should learn. Knight d5, incredibly strong pin. And because black's castled, he's kind of castled into it. He has to play g5, but after knight takes g5, there's this horrible idea, and the king has become exposed. The king is not safe there. If you take, this is winning for white, and if you take on d5, white's queen can fly over, and if the king was on e8, maybe black has some chances of surviving. But after pawn takes, bishop takes, white has an overwhelming attack in this position. Bishop f6 might well be coming. It can't survive. So this position is actually quite strange in that they're both waiting for the other side to commit their king. And you could say the same mistake can be made now by white castling. This is premature and incorrect because you're not taking into account some aggressive plans your opponent has. Breaking the rule book by now, I mean, here you could say, well, I'm supposed to castle. It's the rule book. My opponent's not supposed to play g5, opening up on the wing. Well, again, sometimes breaking the rules does work. And if it starts an attack, it sure well should work. g5. This sacrifice here is not going to work so well, or work at all, because you've even one tempo behind, bring the knight in. And after bishop g4, black can play h5. And already white is on the verge of losing. These pawns are creating havoc. The black king can always try to escape that way, but the black king is in a lot less danger than the castle king. White has to try h4 here, but then black is very comfortable after a pawn advance, etc., or even capturing at the right moment, opening up, knight. You know, there's lots of options, probably just g4. But if you do try to take on g5, the danger now accelerates with h4. And white might have thought, oh, okay, well, I can take on f7. This must be all right. And this is quite a famous trick position, this one. Because now black can sacrifice the queen. You have to really grab that one now. And after bishop g4, these threats against the white king are tremendous with the pawn there. What can be played? The black knight is also coming in. So if you try moving the queen, black gains an advantage by knight d4, threatening to come in with rook takes at h2. So if you take here, knight e2 will win the queen back with a good position. If you try h3 to keep it closed, then knight e2 check. And you have to give up your queen because king h1 leads to a horrible checkmate for white. I'll let you guys work that one out. Hopefully you can see it. But after queen takes e2, again, this position is still very dangerous for the king. Black has a nice advantage. There has been a game which continued bishop g4, knight f7, trying to get rid of that rook, sacrificing the queen back. But now black said, no, I'm going to keep my rook because you're king. Queen d2, and now the knight comes in again, but white has no resources now. The funny line is pawn takes pawn, knight f3, double checkmate, bonus points. Apparently you get 2 wins if you're ever able to do that one. No, you don't. And here, if white tries knight c3 to cover that one, hopefully you can see the win here. Forcing moves, knight f3, bishop takes f3. This is coming. And white has to play queen to h6, but this doesn't matter. We don't take the queen. We do what we call the windmill. Check, king h1, check, king g1. This bishop is alive. Check, king h1, and checkmate. A very beautiful example by the author. So, of course, in some situation, castles is not the right thing to do, and this is a prime example of that. You're castling into an attack. I mean, you know, in hindsight, after this move, h4 might well be playable, but the principle of allowing black this activity is pretty scary. So be aware, castling normally good, but not always, especially when your opponent hasn't castled and has ideas of as an attack on that side of the board. So castling, normal way to play, and we looked at some situations when, you know, it's correct to do it and not to do it, as in the last case, castling into an attack. And I mentioned before that it's also occasionally a good idea to be super flexible, meaning that you might want to wait and see where to castle for a number of reasons. Number one, you might want to start a pawn storm against your enemy's king. And if you castle one way and your opponent goes that way, the same way as you, you won't be able to do the pawn storm as effectively because you'll open up your own king. On the other hand, if you wait until your opponent castles, then go the opposite way to his king, your pawn storm will become more effective because your rooks can go behind the pawns and your king's not there as a target. So it can sometimes be a sort of wait and see situation. Wait and see what your opponent does and be quite subtle about it. I mean, if you have this extra knowledge over your opponent might quickly castle and get himself into an uncomfortable situation. Let's take the following example here. And this position, we'll look at it from the white side. What should white do? Well, it's, you know, not so clear. I mean, I think white should be better here because the pawn structure in the center is closed, but white has more space. White has this very attractive sort of pyramid there in the center, and he has a little bit more space to maneuver, and his pieces have more potential. Bishop on d7 is bad. This bishop could open up. So, of course, talking about the bishop opening up, we should look at pawn breaks. And a typical break in this position would be at some point g4. White's not going to win this position without doing a pawn break. White has to play a pawn break at some moment. And either g4 is going to be correct, or the other way to try and play this would be to advance the b and a pawns to create some problems for black over there. Can black do anything active? We should obviously consider this. Do we have time to sort of, not rush? Black can't really do much here. I mean, black can't do g5 easily. And the other pawn break to worry about, c5, is blocked by the knight. But we should kind of keep an eye on that. But even if he plays c5, we've seen ideas where we can take that one and blockade the center with a piece, get a very good knight on d4. So it's not really anything to worry about here. And now the author sort of goes into thinking strategy for white. And he first of all demonstrates what happens if white just castles without much thought kingside. I mean, I don't think any of the moves that white can play in the position are necessarily bad, but it's the thought process behind them. And if you castle kingside here, in this position, well, this is not obviously a bad move, and you're hoping for black to now castle queenside, I feel, because if he does castle queenside, yeah, you've got your pawn storm, and we know that black's play is quite slow. So after b4, the normal way to attack in this position would be to put the pawn on a5 first, and then go b5. Because, for example, if you go b5 straight away, maybe the knight comes to a5. But this will be very, very quick, this pawn avalanche, which we'll look at later on in the course. So castling queenside is what we're hoping for in this position. But, of course, black's not going to be compliant in that. And black will probably just castle kingside now that we've committed our king. And here it's like, okay, how do we attack him now? And you have to really play for g4, as we said, either with king h1, rook g1, g4, or h3 and g4. But in this position, black isn't very good. He can defend very well. I mean, one defensive strategy which is very solid is the fianchettoed rook. We'll talk about this later again, but fianchettoing the rook in some situations is very good, and it's really, really tough to break through there. So g6, rook f7, rook g7. I don't think white's going to get any success because your king's in the wrong place. Black might even better break out later on then in the position. All these ideas with g4 are less effective. You might even have to play queen d2 at some point anyway, because the f4 pawn is on pre. I mean, you can't go h3, rook f7, g4 now, because black will just take and take here. So it seems that these g4 ideas after castling are not going to be as effective in this position, because black is well positioned and your king is over there. So black should be all right here. And black can slowly move the knight, play b6 maybe, and then c5, create some counterplay. But of course, white is okay here. White cannot be worse, probably slightly better still, but you haven't made the maximum out of the position which you could. So in the next video, we're just going to have a look at another way that white could have thought about the position. Another approach, therefore, to this same position is for white to be a bit more subtle about the way he plays it, and that, I feel, offers white much greater chances of success. So in this position, maybe just play a useful waiting move, which will improve white's position and give your opponent a chance to go wrong. This is often what chess is about. I mean, your opponent may not go wrong, but the more chances you give him to go wrong, the more likely he is to go wrong. I mean, it's simple mathematics. And here, rather than castling straight away, maybe a move such as queen d2 or queen e2 makes sense. Let's put the queen on d2, for example, in this position. And now we can see if our opponent castles kingside, as he did in the last example, which I consider a little bit of a mistake, we can very happily castle queenside, maybe even here. We know that black's pawn storm over here is not going to be very dangerous. I think that's clear. It's going to take a long time to achieve, and he's going to have to prepare it. And even when he gets pawns here, we can easily meet it with some other break. On the other hand, when we play g4, which is only going to take 2 moves with a rook or a pawn, it's going to be much more dangerous for our opponent because our bishop greatly opens up towards the black king. And in this position, because our king's not in g1, we can apply pressure on the g-file, doubling up there after the opening. So this position, the advantage has gone from very slight to a lot more, I feel, for white here, after rook g1 or h3 and g4 to follow. So queen d2 is a much more subtle move, and it would be wrong for black to castle. The author also gives the move queen e2 with some similar ideas. Maybe here on d2 it's better because it covers this square, but maybe the intention of this move is after castles kingside. Was it to play g4 here and if takes some Greek gift? I don't think so. Well, again, this castling kingside is still going to be quite good for white because we can castle queenside. And in this case, I go rook g1 and g4 because my rook on g4 would be guarding my f4 pawn. And again, this is very good. And here, black has that dilemma. So you're giving him a chance to go wrong. And another, I think, equally bad mistake would be if black castles queenside. Because yet again, he commits his king. It's like a Mexican standoff. Both sides are waiting to see how their opponent deploys their most important piece. And only then decide on their attacking policy. Like a war strategy. You'd like to know how your opponent is going to deploy his army first before you deploy yours, because that will give you a vast advantage, but you don't or shouldn't have that information. But here you do. And now that black's castled queenside, well, we can even go b4 immediately, but castling kingside first now is just as good. And with b4, a5, I feel that white's attack is going to be much quicker here. Even if black manages to play g5 in this position, we can simply move our knight. And when black takes on f4, the only way to open us up, we can go rook takes. And it's very hard for black to break through. But on the other hand, we'll see this idea later, when we get our 2 pawns to the 5th rank and play b6, black's position will collapse. The only way you can try to blockade it is with a6, and now we've got a natural capture opening up the king. These kind of ideas are worth thinking about. So in actual fact, after a move like queen e2 or queen d2, you're giving black this chance to go wrong. And here, black is much more advised to also wait and play a move such as knight d8. Preparing some counterplay, the knight was quite bad on c6, bringing it to a more active square, preparing g5. And here, we haven't gained so much by waiting. We can castle either way now, it doesn't really matter. But we gave black the chance to go wrong. Maybe we should play h3 because, again, we're giving our opponent a chance to go wrong. If he castles now, we can play g4 because if he takes it, our bishop is opening up. And if we get this position, big advantage to white. We have all the attacking chances, our opponent has 0. So knight f7 would be a much better reply because now black is saving the opportunity to castle this way. And if we wait one more move and stop g5, which might be a good thing to do, black should now probably commit to castling queenside. Black's played this very cleverly, like we have. And the point of this now is that if we now castle kingside, black is in a much better position and he's gained numerous tempo by moving his knight here. He's gained 2 tempo for a g5 attack. But not just that, we've played a pawn move in front of our king, and playing pawn moves in front of our kings weaken it. This h3 move, this would much rather be back on h2, guarding this. And now with some rook, maybe this rook, why not this rook, because the other rook might be behind here, and g5 to come, it's black who's going to gain the initiative. So after castles queenside, we should probably castle queenside ourselves, and the idea of a flank attack has kind of gone. Probably still some small advantage because of our extra space, but we've given black the chance to go wrong. So I like the more flexible approach in these positions, and it's subtle, and a lot of players obviously will fall into your idea and really communicate where their king's going to be. Now, again, a little warning thing should be said here. If you're going to wait with your king in the middle, it's only going to work in such situations where the centre is blocked. And because of this locked pawn structure in the centre with these 6 pawns, the opening of any central position is not going to occur. So your king is very safe here. You could even go king f2. That's not ridiculous in this position as well. So things to think about. Another thing to think about when considering castling that the author mentions, and this is again a rare case, as a lot of these are, but they do occur, so you should be aware of them, is that castling is unnecessary because the end game is not too far off and you want your king in the middle of the board. The king is better generally in the end game. I mean, I say this is quite rare, but in actually master and grandmaster games, it does occur in a fair few openings in actual fact. And if the moves are going that way, you certainly don't need to be in a rush to castle. If the queens come off the board very quickly for some reason, some opening line, then castling doesn't make a great deal of sense. Let's have a look at one such opening variation, and you'll have to think about opening variations yourself, where this is, you might better use this if you like endings. I know this book is The Art of the Attack, but I've said this before, attacking play and endgames go hand in hand, believe it or not. If you do a good attack, it will often lead to an endgame where you're better, which you have to convert. So if you can't play endings, then your attacking play will suffer. Every area of chess really goes hand in hand. So the following variation, I think actually occurred between Capablanca and Alekhine, and it's quite a main line variation. One thing I note throughout this book, The Art of the Attack, is just how many Queen's Gambit, this position here, Vladimir Vukovich looks at and analyzes. This is really one of the main positions with d4, which is great because it's like the main traditional opening, and I've learnt a fair bit about this opening, even though I play it a lot, from this book. And the middle game plans that it demonstrates is what this book is concentrating on, which I think is much more important than opening plans. Now, bishop g5 is the move that I think predominantly, does it occur in every case, is played in this book. Nowadays, bishop f4 is another option, but this is the traditional line. More popular when the book came out, obviously. Now, e3, and we have standard developing, and here, very normal position. White doesn't want to move his bishop because after pawn takes c4, he loses the tempo, so you've got to find a good waiting move. I prefer queen c2, or have done, because it gives me, in some cases, the option of castle queenside. I like a bit of attacking myself. But rook c1 is the standard move in this position, just preparing for when the c file will open, and it will open most likely at some point. These pawns will be exchanged. c6 is a solid variation, and now bishop d3. As soon as the bishop moves, black captures here. And now a move that Capablanca, I think, played against Alekhine is a move to try to make some exchanges, a freeing maneuver, and that move is knight to d5. And here we've got to do something with our bishop, so capturing on e7, and now knight to e4 is a main idea. And you can see in this variation, after queen b4, we're not going to castle. Our king is going to remain in the center of the board after queen d2, and now we reach this position. And Vukovich goes on to say that this variation was played in a number of games, and he tells me it was the year 1927, the World Championship match between Capablanca and Alekhine. He goes on to mention that white does not worry about castling as the king is better in the centre for the ending. A basic rule really in chess, the king is better in the centre and the ending because it can support both areas of the board and it's in no danger. And now Chessable have added with latest analysis that this position is actually in modern practice, according to the latest computers, quite significantly better for white. I can understand why. White has a stronger centre, white has better development, black has a bad bishop, and white's knight has great potential. The way I'd play this, just out of interest myself, is to try to advance my pawns, gaining some space in both areas of the board, suffocate my opponent, later on in the game look for a pawn break to open up the position. Another case there when castling is not needed though. The last case given by the author, and it's okay, I think a line which he added to the theory of is a bit like the last one, the king in the centre when the queens are exchanged. King can sometimes be better in the centre. And he looks at a variation of Slav from the white point of view, the Slav obviously with c6, knight c3, now d takes c4. It's very interesting actually to see that this move nowadays is a very, very intriguing possibility for white in this position. I've always played the move order with knight c3, but I've come to even think that knight to f3 might be a bit more safer, because after d takes c4, it was considered this was not good enough for equality because of e4. And the old variations, and this is what the author gives with pawn to e5. But modern chess has developed some lines based on the move b5 here. And black has quite a remarkable idea. I'll just show it to you again. It's the evolution of theory. And that is, after the move a4, you have to really try to break these pawns up. Black has a very interesting option here. Now, b4 was always considered the move to play. And these options, by the way, are not as good for black when there's a knight on f3. Because after a4, okay, and now the very interesting move a6, with a knight on f3, white has another possibility, which is b3. But if you play b3 here, then b4 is very annoying when the knight moves some c3 at some point, this kind of concept at least. But the modern idea is this kind of amazing a6 move. I'm not sure who came up with it. And this was considered bad because of knight takes b5. But then black just said, to hell with it. And he took the knight, gave up the exchange, and after something like this, gained very decent counterplay. Very theoretical, this. I think the latest theory standing is that white is better here, but you be advised to know a lot of theory to play this line. Now, going back to this position after e4, e5 was 100 years ago considered to be the main central response here. And the author now goes on to point out that he suggested in a theory manual that d takes e5 is correct. Other possible moves include knight f3 and bishop to c4. I'd probably play one of them. They look a bit more fun. But d takes e5. And after queen takes queen, he now gives king takes d1 an exclamation mark, a good move mark. And he goes on to say that this centralizing tempo in the ending, the king is better here than it is in a castling position. He wants to keep the knight on this active c3 square in this situation. And the king will come to c2 where it's well positioned and supporting moves like b3. And the basic point is castling is no longer needed for white, so you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to waste the tempo with this move. Now, I think there's pros and cons of that again, because this idea of putting a pawn on b4 might try to take advantage of the knight, but I can see the point that black might not want to move a pawn from b5 because of the c4 pawn. And to be fair, I do think Vladimir is correct that this does give white an advantage, because you're going to push with f4 and you have a lovely pawn mass, and your pawn mass is more central, giving you more dynamic play. So I prefer white in this position, and this is one case where giving up castling is fully justified. So yes, when you're getting into an ending, the queens are exchanged, you don't need to castle in a lot of positions. We now move on to the attack on the castled king. Very important, because in the majority of cases, probably 90%, the king will be castled. You know, your opponent will castle, you'll probably castle. And you have to work out what the best middle game strategy is to attack his king in that situation. And there's many different ways of doing this. It's worth, you know, thinking about it. You can do it in a very committal way, a very non-committal way. The non-committal way is better, as we have or will see. What I mean by non-committal, you try to control other elements of the game whilst attacking the king. So you don't commit everything to the attack of the king position, meaning that if it falls through and you don't checkmate him, you will lose because you've lost control of the positional aspects or the queen side. If you can keep control of other areas, like control the center, and attack at the same time, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So it's better to have a controlled attack if you can. So it's much better to, you know, to not throw everything at him unless you have to. And the author then goes on to talk about the history of the attack against the castle king. So the castle king and the history of it. And this I found quite interesting, actually, more from a historical point of view than anything else. So my chess history, I have to say, is somewhat lacking as such. He mentions that the first forms of chess, castling wasn't invented. So castling was just formulating as an idea. And the first ever manuscript on chess was brought out by Lucina, and it was brought out, I think, in 1497. And in that book, that was, I think, the Lucinia book. It was the oldest printed book on chess. I'm just checking my dates now. And in the course of analysing an opening, this one, the Philidor defence, which is later given the name, the author arrives at the position on the top page. So in actual fact, this position I'm going to show you now is apparently, according to Vladimir Vukovich, the first example of an attack on a castle king ever in the history of chess. So you're getting a bit of a history here. This is the first ever printed example, given now a lot of years ago, you know, over 500 years ago, 520 years ago, this position. So it's quite interesting. And the example given is black to play, and this is actually, quite funnily enough, a bit like a black lion. It's a Philidor, and black gets to go g5. Way! And you can see the standard idea. This is actually much better than castling. Castling here is not really needed. You've got to get to the most important aspects of the position. Your rook is probably better on the h-file. And g5, I like it, really forceful play, because your king is well positioned. It's blocked in the center. You don't need to castle. Idea is maybe h5 and g4, which could be crushing. So now knight h2 is given to control that one, and h5. And this is a classic situation of pawns being used to attack the enemy king, and in this case a pawn storm, but maybe in a bit of an unconventional way, because you haven't castled your king. And here white should start some counterplay. We later on call this indirect defense, meaning it's the same as counterplay. The best way to defend is by creating counterplay actively. The best form of defense is attack, they say. And b5 would be the best way to play. But going back all those years, and you might remember that Luciana, who wrote this book, the famous rook ending is named after him, which I hope you all know. Otherwise, get that endgame course with that other guy. What's his name? Oh, Bartholomew. That's the one. And he gives the move f3, which he states is a more, well, I don't know, nowadays we can interpret that going back, chess has developed a lot, and direct defense like this was very common up to even a couple of 100 years ago. But now in modern chess, with computers always striving for activity and tactics if they can, humans have learnt that activity is key. So a move such as b5 would be better. And now knight h6, preparing this one, and only now b5. Rook g8, really preparing this one. And now he gives the move queen e2, which is again a passive move. Taken on c6 would make a lot more sense. And then queen d5, because by swapping queens, you take the punch out of your opponent's attack. And with bishop a3, you're absolutely fine for white here even. Queen e2 allows g4, and now after pawn takes. Another mistake, knight takes g4. Poor defensive technique given by the author of The Art of the Attack. A better idea would have been king to h1. And the point is you have this check here, so you're improving the position of your queen. Now this might not be 100% true, because even when you take here, check, knight f7 seems to cause white some problems. So who was right? Was it going back 500 years to Luciana, or was it going back to Vladimir Vukovic? Maybe Luciana got this one right, and that you had to take on g4. I mean, I'm just sort of paraphrasing their commentary. But I don't know. This position looks okay for black. So Vladimir gives this move, knight takes g4, as poor defensive technique, but it's not clear it actually is. Now, knight takes, pawn takes, and here, rook takes g4 is given by Luciana, but this is one where Vladimir gets completely correct and points out that bishop d8 is a much better move, close to winning. Because the bishop on this diagonal, something that Luciana must have missed, is scary and just winning, actually. So rook takes g4, b takes c6, knight takes c6, knight d5, and only now bishop d8, but now this square is covered. And here another weak move, c4. It's inappropriate to this position. It doesn't add anything. It also cuts out the queen. A much better move would have now been rook a3, which is defending, but also aiming to counterattack via h3. This is another standard form of defense and attack nowadays. c4, and black now brings a piece that's not playing into the attack. Rook f2, queen h7. And white is now lost in this situation. Queen d1 is given a dubious mark by Vukovic, but it was bad anyway. He couldn't save himself. And now black comes down in a typical fashion. Too many attacking pieces. Bishop even can come in. And the game ends with queen h5. And this is stopping king e2. Queen f3. Queen g6. Because now we have rook coming to g3 with tempo. Quite subtle maneuvers, actually. Queen d3. And now the manuscript apparently follows on here with rook g3, queen c2, queen g4, and black goes on to win. So we can see that a little history lesson there on the first example of an attack against the king. Quite I was going to say vulgar. It's so unsophisticated, this chess from another era. How could they play in such a vulgar manner? Not castling their king and just pushing their pawns. It's disgusting. I don't know if vulgar is the right word, but blunt. And also not defending in hardly any of the right ways there for white. Allowing this counterplay, but most importantly, not going active when white could have gone active there. But still, very interesting. I wonder if you get hands on that Luciana manuscript from 520 years ago. I mean, obviously not the original, but a copy of it. It'd be quite interesting to read. So there's your little history lesson for me, and we'll look at one more example of attacks on the king from the past, and then I think we'll move on to some stuff which is more relevant to us actually learning and improving. But history is interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it is. It is. Yes, it is, Simon. I've watched Indiana Jones. So another attack from the past, and I believe this is one that was a little bit more recent than Louisiana, and it was by Greco, and that's a name I've heard of myself. And his, I think it was 16th or 17th century manuscript on chess is a bit more well known, and he indicated in that manuscript some basic combinations which Louisiana didn't. So this is maybe the first manuscript with some patterns forming, attacking patterns. And I think Greco's Spanish, am I right? Could be wrong. You guys might know more history than me. And the next example here we're going to look at is Greco showing a technique of how to attack against the castle king. It's actually funny because he calls this, attacking combination technique, which is used. But to be honest, nowadays, as Vladimir points out, we would probably consider what Greco gives here as an elementary trick and quite beginner level stuff. And again, this is how books like The Art of the Attack have excelled attacking concepts to a totally new and much deeper level. So let's have a look at the continuation from Greco's old book, and maybe the most famous sort of chess book through the 16th, 17th century. And it must be pointed out, as again Vladimir does, that during that period in chess, the 16th, 17th century, techniques in chess, the development of chess was very slow. Nothing really came along or excelled it so much. So this might be the one historical thing in those hundreds of years where some forward motion had been made. So we're going to look at this on the black side because it's the tactic that black uses, and we start off with the Spanish, the Ruy Lopez. Here, bishop c4. So it's interesting to see still this opening is one of the most popular played nowadays. So chess even then had its way of finding what the right starting maneuvers were. They still understood basic principles: center, development, castles. Bishop c5, and Evans' gambit only came along later on when Captain Evans was off on his ship to sea. So castles, and now knight to f6, rook to e1. So they understand this concept of d4. This is all pretty normal. Castles, c3, and now Greco gives queen e7 without, again, understanding some of the finer subtleties of the position. Understandable, it's a long time ago. And Vladimir goes on to point out that Greco had not yet realized the importance of keeping control of the center with such a move, and gives this weak move for black. Vladimir recommends d6, which keeps control of the center. We now know the center is extremely important. And in 2012, Chessable have pointed out in the notes, and again, this is the modern improvement version of this brilliant book, that knight takes e4 is actually a way that black can gain an advantage and initiative, because white has foregone d3, and it's now white's centre who may drop or will drop with d5, typical fork coming. Now after queen e7, d4, we can see that by modern chess, this looks already, to my eyes at least, not the way to play. You're giving away your big standpoint in the centre. I play so many openings myself where I need to have a pawn in the centre of the board, and I need to keep it there. Like the London system, I want my pawn on d4. The Jabava London, I want my pawn there. D4 openings. The French defence, I want my pawn in the centre. I want it there forever. Giving away such a pawn is blasphemy. Blasphemy. My dyslexia kicking in. I do my best. You know what I mean anyway. That's the most important thing. It's not cool. And here, even taking back, white has a big advantage. I mean, two great pawns and black's given up his centre. But e5 is given by Greco. And now knight g4. And here he gives pawn takes d4. In actual fact, b4 is very much playable. And now modern analysis of this position indicates that white is winning if you whack it on a computer. But I certainly wouldn't recommend going for this Greco trick in any of your games, because it is, as noted, really a bit of just a trick. Now, after pawn takes d4, this is where we can play the trick. Do you know the trick? Hopefully this is a move you'll find. Can you play as well as they played 500 years ago? Hopefully. Is it 500? No, 400. What am I saying? 300, 400. I'm losing track of time. Not so simple, but if you spend long enough in this position, you should really see it. And it's a combination of bishop, knight, and queen. And here, if you can't see it, pause. Knight takes d4. Knight takes d4 and queen h4. Greco's trick. One of the oldest tricks in the book. And that's maybe where the phrase comes from. We should call it one of the oldest Grecos in the book. And we hit the two squares. And this is now going to give black an advantage. And one nasty thing that white should watch out for is knight to f3. And please tell me you can work out the checkmate here. This is one of the first checkmates people learn. We're going to look at typical mating positions soon. But one of the prettiest, and of course it is the smothered mate, boom, boom, with knight f2 coming in. I'm sure most of you have seen that before. So bishop e3 is given by Greco, and now we come in with queen takes h2, and knight to e3 is actually given by Vukovic in the book The Art of the Attack, but even stronger is just to go check and now take on g2. The white king is in a lot of trouble, and after rook to g1, because white's position is on the verge of crumbling here, we have knight takes e3. And now things are tough. White should probably try to eliminate the queen. But now after knight takes d1, this knight should move. And it gets a little bit complex now, but as long as black's careful with knight takes b2, knight h6, king h8, and white gets some material back. We have to sacrifice that one, otherwise it's a draw. And now the accurate move, b6, followed by bishop to a6 check. Black is actually winning. He has 3 pawns for the exchange and very active pieces, which nowadays is considered winning. Greco's analysis does not really look at this move. It only considers king takes. Blimmin' hell, Greco. And now, here, he concludes with 2 lines, one line being queen h3 check, king e2, and now a very nice move. So we'll give Greco a little pat on the back, d5. A typical move this, give up a pawn, your opponent's king is in the middle, you want to open lines, get your pieces in, bishop flying in, rook coming in, boom, and black is winning. The other possible line here is bishop takes d4, when the king has to take, queen takes f2, I'm the Pac-Man queen. Those of you who play Pac-Man, I'd love to see someone do that at a chess game, wouldn't you? Maybe get like a sock, get, just your queen's about to go around grabbing all of your opponent's pawns, checking him. And what you do, you subtly take off your shoe, get your sock off, put your sock on your hand, and every time you take a pawn, you go, ah. Sorry. Have I got some messed up sense of humour? I'm just picturing that at the board and just how weird it would be. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to do that. I'll get in trouble. And after here, check, here, there it goes again, with advantage to black. And now, just finishing our kind of history lesson on the, attacking the castle king and attacking in general, which is interesting. It's, something I haven't been versed in. I'm going to now paraphrase some of the things, as I'm not an expert on the history, and I want to read directly from the book now, which I do throughout this course, a little bit of both. And the author goes on to say that in general we have seen quite a serious advance in chess skill over these years, clearly. And the advance in attacking the castle king, first with Philidor, and then particularly the person who really stands out in attacks is Morphy. Morphy was very romantic, and his way of playing was considered romantic, freely giving up pieces, playing with this magical energy, I would say. When Morphy played, his pieces would flow like a river. They really had their own sort of magic behind them, and he always went maximum energy, happy to give them up to gain tempo. He's a tempo player, all about attack. It was beautiful to watch. Now, we then moved on to Steinitz, who brought in much better defensive techniques, and they would have worked very well against Morphy, because Morphy's opponents didn't defend very well. That was not Morphy's fault, but one thing we can say about that part of chess. And this defensive technique influenced, again, other styles that came on later on. And then Lasker, the next world champion. And Lasker, taking these ideas from Steinitz, often moved away from the forcing attacking ideas. And when he became world champion, he actually preferred endgame technique, because he considered attacking style in the spirit of Morphy to be unsound, which maybe it was in some way, because people have defended better. Giving you a history of chess here, aren't I? I hope you pay me for this. Oh, you are. Oh, thank you. And then we go on to talk about. I don't go on, but the author does. I'm sort of again paraphrasing. Have other people who are supporters of the attacking the king. It's often a style thing, and it has been historically. You've got to find your own style. Chigorin, Tarrasch, and Pillsbury were all players who loved attacking, and they're all mentioned heavily throughout this book. They preferred the attacking style, and they enriched techniques of attacking, which weren't maybe seen before. Particularly Chigorin, and he illustrated the power of positional sacrifices, and this is something key today. Chigorin happy to give up a pawn, not necessarily to achieve checkmate or even an attack, but control, dominance of an open file. This we see very recently in the games of AlphaZero, the strongest chess fiend about, this neural network learning system. And AlphaZero has demonstrated the absolute happiness to play in a style where it sacrifices pawns, multitude of pawns, for positional play, going back to the days of Chigorin in some respects. Tarrasch, his real effect was, and again we're going to see all these players, rapid development, maybe a little bit like Morphy, I would say personally, and that pieces were good, and a strong centre was basically good pieces, and a strong centre were the requirements for an attack against the castle king. We're mainly talking about castle king attacks now, as that's the most common. And it's very interesting how things have developed. Pillsbury created a kind of synthesis on the attacking style and the positional endgame play, and then Steinitz and Lasker are more endgame players. So it's interesting to see this. And then the real blossoming occurred, the author goes on, when the likes of Capablanca and Alekhine came along. and their dynamic style affected and developed chess again, and and a lot of relevance today in chess can be related to them. I mean, I know from watching their games. Let's take Alekhine to start with. Alekhine had this way of not really risking the attack, but controlling every area of the board. He wanted to be a complete puppet master and control the queen side, king side, stop his opponent's counterplay, and timing the attack, but not rushing the attack, having patience, which Morphy maybe did not have, for example. Same kind of goes for Capablanca. So they brought a lot of maturity into attacks, which really is shown nowadays. In order to get a successful attack at top level now, which is out of the realms of the book, The Art of the Attack, it involves so many different principles. It's very hard for the top players to just attack successfully. They can't do it in every game, but it does happen. And normally when you see these games, it comes about from them playing other things to create weaknesses, positional weaknesses, and then an opportunity arises, they grab it. So we still see great attacking games nowadays, but in a much more refined way. And hopefully you can see that from the course of this book. And in the conclusion at the end, I will talk about that more.